In the most exclusive section of Bel Air, behind gates and manicured hedges, stands one of Los Angeles's most spectacular estates. Kasa Encantada, the Enchanted House, is a 40,000-square-foot Georgian mansion with 60 rooms, formal gardens, and a ballroom that once hosted Hollywood royalty. It's valued at over $150 million today. For nearly 2 decades, it was home to Conrad Hilton, the man who built the world's first international hotel empire. But this enchanted house was anything but magical for the people who lived in it. It was the headquarters of a man who built a fortune by understanding that people would pay for the illusion of luxury while he pocketed the difference. It was home to a family so dysfunctional that when Conrad died, he left almost nothing to his children, cutting them out of a billion-dollar fortune in one final act of control. And it's the origin point of a family curse that has played out across 4 generations, from Conrad's abusive son Nicky beating Elizabeth Taylor, to Paris Hilton turning the family name into a punchline. This is the story of how one man built an empire on the loneliness of travelers, how his obsession with wealth destroyed everyone close to him, and how the Hilton fortune has brought nothing but misery to nearly everyone who inherited it. Conrad Nicholson Hilton was born on Christmas Day, 1887, in San Antonio, New Mexico Territory, not yet even a state. His father, Augustus, ran a general store that doubled as a boarding house. Young Conrad grew up watching strangers pay his family for a place to sleep, and he learned an important lesson. Hospitality was a business, not a kindness. You gave people the minimum they needed to feel taken care of, and you charged them the maximum they were willing to pay. His childhood was marked by poverty and instability. New Mexico was rough country, and the Hilton family struggled constantly with money. Conrad's father drank heavily and had a violent temper. His mother, Mary, was deeply religious and tried to instill Catholic values in her children, while her husband raged and the family teetered on the edge of financial collapse. Conrad learned to survive by being shrewd, calculating, and emotionally distant. Sentiment was a luxury his family couldn't afford. When his father died in 1919, Conrad didn't grieve long. He saw an opportunity. He took what little inheritance there was and headed to Texas to buy a bank. The bank deal fell through, but Hilton noticed something. The hotel across from the bank was packed with oil workers, men sleeping in shifts, paying for beds by the hour. The owner was overwhelmed and mentioned he might sell. Hilton bought the hotel on the spot with borrowed money. It was 1919. He was 31 years old, and he had just discovered his life's calling, profiting from other people's need for temporary refuge. Hilton's insight was simple but revolutionary. Hotels weren't about hospitality. They were about maximizing revenue per square foot. He didn't care about making guests comfortable. He cared about fitting as many paying customers into a building as possible while spending as little as possible on their comfort. He began buying hotels across Texas during the oil boom, always with the same formula. He would purchase struggling properties, gut them, reconfigure the space to add more rooms, reduce staff to the bare minimum, cut costs ruthlessly, and then market them as luxury while providing anything but. His employees learned quickly that Conrad Hilton cared about exactly one thing: profit margins. Wages were kept low. Working conditions were poor. Staff were expected to maintain an appearance of gracious service while being given inadequate resources to do so. Hilton believed that if employees weren't slightly desperate, they wouldn't work hard enough. Keep them hungry, keep them grateful for any job, and they'll do whatever you demand. Former employees from his early hotels left scathing accounts of working conditions. Chambermaids were expected to clean twice as many rooms as was reasonable. Kitchen staff worked with outdated equipment. Maintenance was deferred until things literally broke. But the lobbies always looked grand, the advertising always promised luxury, and the guests, staying for a night or two before moving on, rarely noticed the rot underneath. By 1925, Hilton had opened the Dallas Hilton, his first property built from the ground up. It was 15 stories and 400 rooms, enormous for the time. The marketing called it the finest hotel in the Southwest. The reality was that rooms were cramped, walls were thin, and the whole operation was designed to extract maximum profit from minimum investment. But here's the thing, it worked. Travelers didn't want to spend money on hotels. They wanted cheap, acceptable places to sleep. Hilton gave them that while making them feel like they were getting luxury. He was a pioneer of what we now call the gap between branding and reality. The Hilton name promised more than Hilton properties delivered, and the difference between promise and reality was pure profit. The stock market crash of 1929 should have destroyed him. Many hotel owners went bankrupt. Hilton survived by being more ruthless than anyone else. He slashed staff to skeleton crews. He stopped all maintenance that wasn't absolutely critical. He negotiated brutal deals with creditors, promising payment later while keeping his hotels operational now. Some of those creditors never got fully paid. Hilton didn't care. He had survived, and survival was all that mattered. By the late 1930s, Hilton was back on his feet and expanding. He had learned an important lesson from the Depression. Debt was leverage. If you owed enough money to enough banks, they couldn't let you fail. So he borrowed aggressively, bought more hotels, borrowed against those, and kept expanding. By 1942, he owned a chain of hotels across the Southwest and was eyeing bigger markets. In 1942, Hilton made his power move. He bought the townhouse in Los Angeles and the Plaza Hotel in New York. These weren't struggling properties in Texas oil towns. These were prestigious hotels in America's most important cities. Suddenly, Conrad Hilton wasn't just a regional hotel operator. He was a national player. More importantly, he had entered the world of celebrity and high society. Movie stars stayed at his hotels. Politicians held fundraisers in his ballrooms. The wealthy and powerful were now his customers. And Hilton understood that proximity to that world could make him rich beyond imagination. In 1945, he married his second wife. His first marriage to Mary Barron had ended in divorce after producing 3 sons. The new bride was Zsa Zsa Gabor, a Hungarian actress and socialite 23 years his junior. On paper, it looked like a Hollywood fairy tale, the hotel tycoon and the glamorous starlet. In reality, it was a transaction. Zsa Zsa wanted money and status. Conrad wanted a beautiful wife to impress business associates and prove he had arrived in high society. The marriage was a disaster from the start. Zsa Zsa later described Conrad as cheap, cold, and obsessed with money to the exclusion of all human feeling. She said he would check restaurant bills to make sure they weren't being overcharged for meals. He reused tea bags. He turned off lights in rooms nobody was using to save electricity. This was a man worth tens of millions of dollars who behaved like he was one bad month away from poverty. But the cheapness went deeper than just saving money. It was about control. Conrad controlled the finances, which meant he controlled Zsa Zsa. She needed his permission to buy clothes, to go out, to spend any money at all. He monitored her activities, questioned her purchases, and made her account for every dime. Zsa Zsa, who had married him for money and freedom, found herself trapped in a gilded cage with a warden who happened to be her husband. She fought back the only way she knew how, by spending even more extravagantly, by flaunting her affairs, by publicly humiliating Conrad whenever possible. Their fights were legendary, screaming matches in hotel lobbies, thrown dishes, mutual accusations. The marriage lasted 5 years and produced 1 daughter, Francesca. Zsa Zsa later said marrying Conrad Hilton was the biggest mistake of her life. Conrad, for his part, seemed to view the marriage as a failed business transaction. He had invested time and money in a beautiful wife, and the return on investment hadn't justified the cost. The divorce in 1947 was vicious. Conrad fought to minimize the settlement. Zsa Zsa fought to maximize it. They used their daughter as a weapon against each other. The whole mess played out in the tabloids, with both sides leaking embarrassing details. Conrad came across as a cold, controlling cheapskate. Zsa Zsa came across as a gold digger. Both portrayals were probably accurate. After the divorce, Conrad buried himself in work and expansion. In 1949, he achieved something no other hotelier had done. He bought the legendary Waldorf Astoria in New York City. It was the crown jewel of American hotels, a symbol of elegance and prestige. The purchase made Hilton a household name. It was also around this time that Conrad purchased Kasa Encantada in Bel Air. The estate had been built in 1937 for Hilda Bolt Weber, widow of a glass manufacturer, at a cost of $2 million. Roughly $40 million in today's money. It was one of the finest houses in Los Angeles, designed in the Georgian style with 60 rooms spread across 40,000 square feet. The house sat on an 8-acre estate with formal gardens, a tennis court, and panoramic views from Beverly Hills to the Pacific Ocean. The interiors were museum quality, with hand-carved woodwork, imported marble, and crystal chandeliers. The ballroom could accommodate 300 guests. There was a separate guest house, servants' quarters, and a garage for a dozen cars. For Conrad Hilton, Kasa Encantada was the ultimate symbol of his success. He had risen from poverty in New Mexico territory to owning one of the finest estates in America. He threw lavish parties, hosted business associates, and used the mansion to project an image of wealth and power. But the people who lived there told a different story. Conrad's third wife, Mary Frances Kelly, whom he married in 1976, yes, he was 89 and she was 51, later described Kasa Encantada as the loneliest place on earth. The enormous house was mostly empty. Conrad spent most of his time in his study, working. When he did emerge, it was usually to criticize something. The staff had been wasteful, expenses were too high, something had been done inefficiently. The mansion that was supposed to be an enchanted house was actually a monument to isolation. Conrad had everything money could buy, and nobody to share it with who actually wanted to be there. But the real tragedy of the Hilton fortune wasn't Conrad's loneliness. It was what he did to his children. He had 3 sons from his first marriage: Conrad, Nicky, Hilton Jr., Baron Hilton, and Eric Hilton. He raised them to be ruthless businessmen, to value money above all else, to see relationships as transactions. And then he seemed surprised when they turned out damaged. Nicky, the eldest, got the worst of it. Conrad groomed him to take over the hotel empire, which meant subjecting him to constant criticism and impossible standards. Nothing Nicky did was good enough. Every decision was questioned. Every success was minimized. Conrad seemed to believe that breaking his son down would make him stronger. Instead, it made him an alcoholic. By his 20s, Nicky was drinking heavily and using his father's money and name to party his way through Hollywood. He was handsome, rich, and deeply unhappy. In 1950, at age 23, he married 18-year-old Elizabeth Taylor in what was supposed to be Hollywood's wedding of the decade. The marriage lasted 8 months. Elizabeth later described it as the worst period of her life. Nicky was an abusive drunk who took out his father's emotional abuse on his young wife. He would disappear for days on benders, come home violent, and blame Elizabeth for his problems. He hit her. He screamed at her. He made her life hell. When Elizabeth filed for divorce, she cited mental cruelty. She was too young and too terrified to publicly admit he had beaten her. That would come later, in her memoirs. But people close to the couple knew. Nicky Hilton had inherited his father's emotional damage and turned it into violence. Conrad's response to his son's failed marriage: anger that Nicky had embarrassed the family name. Not concern for Nicky's drinking. Not remorse that maybe he had raised his son poorly. Just anger about bad publicity affecting the Hilton brand. Nicky continued spiraling. He married twice more, both marriages ending in divorce and accusations of abuse. He drank himself into oblivion most nights. He spent his father's money recklessly, as if trying to punish Conrad through waste. And in 1969, at age 42, Nicky Hilton died of a heart attack brought on by years of alcohol abuse. Conrad's reaction to his son's death was characteristic. He mentioned at the funeral that Nicky had been a disappointment, that he had squandered his opportunities, that he had never lived up to his potential. Even in death, no grace, no forgiveness, no admission that maybe Conrad's parenting had contributed to Nicky's destruction. Baron Hilton, the second son, survived his father's parenting by becoming exactly what Conrad wanted: a ruthless businessman with no apparent emotional needs. Baron took over the hotel empire and expanded it aggressively. He was competent, cold, and entirely focused on profit margins, a perfect reflection of his father's values. But Baron also learned to protect himself by keeping Conrad at arm's length emotionally. He didn't seek his father's approval because he knew it would never come. He didn't try to have a relationship because he understood Conrad wasn't capable of one. Baron survived by becoming a machine, just like his father. The cost was his own humanity. Eric Hilton, the youngest son, chose a different path. He stayed out of the hotel business entirely and maintained minimal contact with his father. He married, had children, and built a life as far from Conrad's shadow as possible. Conrad viewed this as weakness and largely ignored Eric, which was probably the kindest thing he could have done. And then there was Francesca, Conrad's daughter with Zsa Zsa Gabor. She grew up caught between her father's coldness and her mother's narcissism, neither parent particularly interested in her except as a weapon against the other. Francesca later struggled with addiction and depression, wrote a memoir describing her lonely, miserable childhood, and generally seemed to confirm that being a Hilton came with serious psychological damage. This was Conrad Hilton's family legacy. One son dead from alcoholism after a life of violence. One son turned into an emotionless business machine. One son in hiding, and one daughter traumatized by being the child of two people who should never have had children. But Conrad's final act of cruelty came after his death. In 1979, at age 91, Conrad Hilton died at Kasa, Encantada. He left behind an estate worth approximately $200 million, over $800 million today, control of a hotel empire worth billions, and a will that shocked everyone who read it. Conrad left the vast majority of his fortune to the Conrad Inn, Hilton Foundation, a charity he had established in 1944. Of his personal fortune, 97% went to the foundation. His children and grandchildren were left with minimal bequests, just enough to avoid a legal challenge, but nowhere near what they expected or what other billionaires typically left family members. Barron received some shares in Hilton hotels, but nothing close to control. The other children received even less. The grandchildren got token amounts. The message was clear. Conrad Hilton cared more about his name on a foundation than he did about his own descendants. The will even contained specific language about why he was doing this. He wrote that he was concerned his family would waste the money, that they hadn't proven themselves worthy stewards of the fortune, that the foundation would use the money more wisely than his heirs could. It was a final insult from beyond the grave. Your father thought so little of you that he gave his money to strangers rather than his own children. Barron challenged the will, of course. The legal battle dragged on for years. Eventually, a settlement was reached that gave Barron more control of Hilton Hotels Corporation and reduced the foundation's immediate payout, but the basic structure remained. Conrad's heirs got a fraction of what they might have expected. The irony is that Conrad had spent his entire life trying to build a dynasty, only to ensure that dynasty would collapse by cutting his family out of the fortune. The Hilton name would continue on hotels around the world, but the Hilton family would be increasingly disconnected from the actual empire. After Conrad's death, Kasa Encantada was sold. The estate passed through various owners over the decades. David Murdoch bought it in 1980 for $12.4 million, later selling it to financier Gary Winnick for $94 million in 2000. Each owner maintained the mansion's grandeur while erasing any trace of Conrad Hilton's occupation. The house that Conrad had used to project power and success became just another Los Angeles trophy property, changing hands among billionaires who wanted the prestige but had no connection to its history. None of Conrad's descendants wanted it. None could afford it, even with their inheritance. Kasa Encantada had served its purpose for Conrad. It had symbolized his rise, and then it moved on, indifferent to the family that had briefly occupied it. Today, the estate is worth an estimated $150 to $200 million. It's occasionally rented out for events and film shoots. The current owners keep it meticulously maintained, preserved as a perfect example of 1930s Georgian architecture. But there's nothing in the house to indicate that Conrad Hilton ever lived there. No plaques, no mentions in the tour literature, no acknowledgement that this was once the headquarters of a hotel empire. In a way, this erasure is fitting. Conrad spent his life building hotels, temporary residences for people passing through. Kasa Encantada was just another temporary residence for him, and now he's passed through and been forgotten. The man who built an empire on the impermanence of travel became impermanent himself. But the Hilton story doesn't end with Conrad's death or the sale of his mansion. The curse of the Hilton fortune has continued through subsequent generations, with each iteration seeming to prove Conrad's posthumous judgment about his family's unworthiness. Nikki Hilton's daughter with Elizabeth Taylor, also named Francesca, has lived a relatively quiet life away from the spotlight, perhaps the healthiest choice any Hilton has made. But Conrad's great-grandchildren have turned the family name into something Conrad never could have imagined, a brand associated with celebrity excess, manufactured scandal, and the kind of wealth without purpose that he claimed to despise. Paris Hilton, Barron's granddaughter, became famous in the early 2000s for essentially being famous, for partying, for a leaked sex tape, for the reality show The Simple Life, for embodying every criticism ever leveled at trust fund kids. She turned Hilton from a hotel chain into a punchline, from a symbol of American business success into shorthand for vapid celebrity culture. And here's the perverse irony. Paris Hilton has probably done more to keep the Hilton name in the public consciousness than any hotel opening in the last 30 years. But it's not the kind of recognition Conrad would have wanted. He built an empire to prove he was a serious businessman, a self-made success, a titan of industry. His great-granddaughter became famous for a sex tape and saying, "That's hot." Paris has claimed in recent years that her public persona was an act, that she deliberately played dumb to build a brand. If that's true, it's almost brilliant. She learned from her great-grandfather that perception can be more valuable than reality, that you can build an empire on the gap between what you promise and what you deliver. Conrad did it with hotels. Paris did it with herself. But the damage to the family goes beyond bad publicity. Multiple Hilton descendants have struggled with substance abuse, failed marriages, and general aimlessness. The pattern that started with Conrad's parenting has repeated across generations. Children raised in wealth without purpose, given every material advantage, but no emotional foundation, taught that money solves all problems while experiencing firsthand that it solves none. The Hilton Hotel Corporation itself has become detached from the Hilton family in any meaningful sense. Barron sold the company to Blackstone Group in 2007 for $26 billion. The Hiltons maintain some ownership stake, but they no longer control the empire Conrad built. The name remains on hotels worldwide, but the family connection is historical rather than operational. This is the final irony of Conrad Hilton's story. He built an empire with his name on it, cut his family out of most of the inheritance, and then watched that empire slip away from family control entirely within a generation of his death. The Hilton name endures on hotels around the world, but it's just a brand now, owned by private equity, managed by professionals, disconnected from the family that created it. What remains is the foundation Conrad left most of his fortune to. The Conrad Inn. Hilton Foundation is genuinely substantial, with over $3 billion in assets, funding work on water access, homelessness, and disaster relief. By almost any objective measure, the foundation has done real good in the world, probably more good than Conrad himself ever did while alive. But you can't help wondering, was the foundation about altruism, or was it about control? Did Conrad genuinely want to help humanity, or did he just want to ensure that his money would be used according to his wishes long after his death? Did he create a charitable legacy out of generosity, or was it one final way to assert dominance, even over his own descendants, even from the grave? Knowing Conrad's personality, his obsession with control, his inability to let go of anything, it's hard not to suspect the latter. The foundation wasn't about helping people. It was about ensuring Conrad Hilton remained important, remained in control, remained the center of attention even decades after death. There's a concept in psychology called generational trauma, the idea that the damage done to one generation echoes through subsequent ones, that children raised in dysfunction raise dysfunctional children themselves, creating cycles of harm that persist long after the original trauma is gone. The Hilton family is a textbook case. Conrad, raised by an alcoholic father in poverty, learned that emotion was weakness and money was the only security. He raised his children to be emotionally stunted profit maximizers. They raised their children in wealth, but with deep dysfunction. Those children have struggled with substance abuse, failed relationships, and public scandals. Each generation trying to escape the damage of the previous one. Each generation discovering that wealth can't heal wounds that money created. Each generation passing on new variations of the same fundamental brokenness. And at the center of it all is the fortune itself. The billions of dollars Conrad accumulated by understanding that loneliness is profitable, that people will pay for temporary refuge, that you can build an empire on the gap between what travelers need and what they'll settle for. That fortune was supposed to be the solution, the thing that would prove the Hiltons mattered, that would give them security, that would make them powerful. Instead, it became the problem. It destroyed relationships, warped priorities, and created expectations that could never be fulfilled. Conrad thought he was building a dynasty. What he actually built was a very expensive trap that each generation of Hiltons has struggled to escape. Today, if you want to understand the Hilton legacy, you don't visit Kasa Encantada. You can't. It's a private residence. You don't tour Hilton Hotel's headquarters. It's just office space. You don't visit Conrad's grave and contemplate his achievements. Instead, you check into any Hilton hotel anywhere in the world. You walk into the lobby and see the branding, the promise of comfort and luxury. You check into your room and find it adequate but not exceptional, clean but impersonal, expensive for what you get but acceptable for what you need. You're experiencing Conrad Hilton's vision: standardized hospitality, commodified comfort, the business of making people feel temporarily at home while ensuring they never forget they're just guests. You're paying for the illusion of luxury while the owners pocket the gap between illusion and reality. This is Conrad's real legacy, not Kasa Encantada, or the foundation, or even a family drama. It's the understanding that hospitality could be industrialized, that comfort could be branded, that people would pay for the feeling of being taken care of even when they weren't really being taken care of at all. Every chain hotel in the world follows Hilton's template. Promise more than you deliver, standardize everything, minimize costs, maximize revenue per square foot, treat both employees and guests as resources to be managed rather than people to be served. This is the world Conrad Hilton created, and we're all living in it every time we check into a hotel room. And just like Conrad's children, we're all trapped in a system that promises comfort and security, but delivers isolation and impermanence. We're all guests in our own lives, temporarily occupying spaces we don't really own, paying for the privilege of feeling at home somewhere that isn't actually home. There's a photograph of Conrad Hilton from the 1960s, taken at Kasa Encantada. He's sitting alone in the enormous library, surrounded by books he probably never read, in a house too large for one person, working at a desk piled with hotel financial reports. He's in his 80s, wealthy beyond imagination, and he looks absolutely miserable. That photograph captures something essential about the hotel fortune and what it cost. Conrad built an empire on understanding that travelers are fundamentally lonely. They're away from home, away from family, in unfamiliar places. He profited from that loneliness by offering temporary refuge. But in doing so, he made himself the loneliest person of all. He built hotels instead of a home. He accumulated wealth instead of relationships. He created an empire instead of a family. And he died alone in his mansion, surrounded by luxury he could no longer enjoy, having cut off the few people who might have mourned him sincerely. The enchanted house was never enchanted. It was a prison, just a more expensive one than most people can afford. And Conrad Hilton was its most dedicated prisoner, serving a life sentence in luxury he had imposed on himself. Kasa Encantada still stands in Bel Air, as beautiful as ever. The gardens are maintained by professional staff. The ballroom still gleams. The 60 rooms are perfectly preserved. It's one of the finest houses in America, a masterpiece of architecture and design. But it's also empty of meaning, a beautiful shell that has been occupied by a series of people who used it to project wealth and power, then moved on. Conrad Hilton was just one of those temporary residents, no more permanent than the guests in his hotels. The Hilton name remains on hotel buildings worldwide, a brand that promises comfort and delivers adequacy, that markets luxury and provides standardization. The Hilton family continues its multi-generational struggle with the fortune Conrad built, each generation discovering new ways to be damaged by inherited wealth. And the Conrad Inn. Hilton Foundation continues its work, funded by a fortune built on the loneliness of travelers, trying to do good with money earned from people's need for temporary refuge. All of it, the mansion, the hotels, the family dysfunction, the foundation, is Conrad Hilton's legacy. A legacy that proves you can build an empire and lose everything that matters. That you can become a household name and die alone. That you can accumulate billions and leave behind nothing but damage. The dark story of the Hilton fortune isn't about spectacular failure or sudden downfall. It's about the slow realization that winning at business can mean losing at life. That you can get everything you want and discover it wasn't worth what you paid. That the enchanted house was never enchanted at all. It was just expensive. And that's the darkest truth of all. Conrad Hilton achieved exactly what he set out to achieve. He built a hotel empire that bears his name. He accumulated enormous wealth. He owned one of the finest estates in America. He created a foundation that continues his legacy. He got everything he wanted. And it wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. Because what he wanted was fundamentally empty. Recognition without relationship. Wealth without warmth. Success without meaning. Kasa Encantada stands as a monument to that emptiness. Beautiful, valuable, perfectly maintained, and completely hollow. Just like the fortune that bought it. Just like the man who lived there. Just like the legacy he left behind. The enchanted house was never enchanted. It was cursed from the beginning. And 4 generations later, the Hiltons are still living with that curse. Still trying to escape the fortune that was supposed to set them free. Still discovering that you can check out anytime you like, but you can never really leave.